So we're on this journey with the Israelites, and the journey started clear back with Abraham. And I want to remind you that one of the things that we're trying to discover in this journey is how to hear God's voice better. And we learn to hear God's voice better and better through the circumstances of life. And we'll see through the circumstances of the children of Israel leaving Egypt and moving up toward the promised land, that they experience a lot of different ways to hear God's voice. So there were 4 surgeons having a discussion about surgery, and the first surgeon said, I'd really like to operate on accountants because when you open them up, everything's numbered. And the second surgeon said, I really like to operate on librarians because everything's in alphabetical order. And the third one said, I like to work on electricians because everything's color-coded. And the last one said, I kind of like to work on mechanics because when you get done, if there's stuff left over, they don't really mind so much. And I tell you that story because there are some things that it's perfectly fine not to agree about when we're looking at events in the Bible. And the Bible is extremely, extremely important, but we always need to remember that the first probably 1,500 years of the church, 90% of Christians didn't have a Bible. And so you can't say that it's essential for our Christian living. It's really important, and we're so grateful that we all have multiple copies of it. But it's not essential. So that helps us to approach it from the standpoint of what is it, why do we have it, and what's important about it. And so I'm saying that to you because there's some very differences of opinion as we come to this point in the story. So the Israelites have been in the land of Egypt, and they're living primarily, where's the button here, up in this area right up in here, which is the land of Goshen. And during their some 400 years, they evolved from being guests to being slaves. And it's not a huge area. And we don't really know by the time of the Passover, by the time of the Exodus, how many Israelites there were. If you just simply take the numbers at strict view, it would be in somewhere between 1 and 2 million Israelites. So there are some people that believe that there are 1 to 2 million Israelites that are leaving in the Exodus. My opinion is that there was considerably less than that. I think it was probably more in the thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, but less than that. And I have some specific reasons for that. And if you want to talk about that during Sunday school, I'll be happy to do that. But nevertheless, this tribe of Israelites, they leave Egypt, and the traditional route going the wrong way, for the Exodus is right here. Oops, excuse me, wrong button. I'm really good at this machine. Where is that button? There it is. Okay, so here's the land of Goshen. So the traditional route is that they come south here, and then somewhere along in here, they cross this portion of the Red Sea. And then they wander down in here, and this is traditionally Mount Sinai, and so they spend 40 years in this area right here. I have come to a different conclusion. That's not just simply my conclusion, but as I study this, my belief is that the Israelites actually traveled down this side and went all the way down to this peak, and it was here they were confronted, and they came to a dead end. There was nowhere they could go. They couldn't go east, they couldn't go west. The Egyptians are coming down behind them. This entire area actually is controlled by the Egyptians up into at least 500 BC, perhaps even up to the time of Christ. So it was a scary area. So, and the Egyptians had a mine, very prominent mine, somewhere around in here. And so my theory is they came south down here, they gathered the slaves that were working at the mine, carried them with them, released them from prison, ended up down here. And right here is a very interesting, unusual geographic, no, that's the wrong word. Geological, thank you, thing that happens right here. In this area, there is a coral ridge that it stretches almost the entire distance, and most of that water is only like 15 feet deep, except for 2 large deep passages where the shipping goes through. So what I surmise happened, and you know what, I love to look at God's miracles and see, well, is there any way that he could have done that using natural events? He doesn't have to. He can work outside of nature, and we'll see in a minute how he does that. But I also think that sometimes he just uses events in nature and works them and tweaks them. So this is my theory on what happened. I think when they got down there, this coral ridge stretched clear across, and it was too deep to wade, too deep to swim, 15, 20 feet deep. And God caused an earthquake somewhere out in here, which caused all the water, you know, what happens in an earthquake, a lot of water comes rushing out. They cross on dry coral dries really quickly. They all walk across. They're over into the end of, area of Saudi Arabia. And then the tsunami comes. And the tsunami happens just as the Egyptians are crossing this area and wipes them out, blows them all up into the Sea of Aqaba. And fascinating, there have been divers that have discovered all kinds of Egyptian chariots in this region. And no one knows how they got there. And in the course of that, also that tsunami created these two huge, deep gashes, which then became shipping lanes. And so then for the next 40 years, rather than wandering around in this tiny little area, which is about 100 miles wide and 200 miles long, so it'd be like wandering around in half of western Washington for 40 years. They wandered around in the Arabian wilderness in here. So and as I say, you know, we don't honestly know how it all worked because all these places aren't listed anymore. They aren't on maps. I mean, we have put them on maps and say we think this is where they are, but you don't know for sure. So I just tell you that because it interests me, and we can, if you're curious to dialogue more about it, we can do that during Sunday school. But nevertheless, they come to, you know, they've crossed whatever point of water they crossed, and the Egyptians have been destroyed. And in chapter 15 of Exodus, there is this amazing song that was created by Miriam. And the song there's actually a chorus that we sing, the horse and rider cast into the sea. And if you didn't understand the context of that chorus, you'd think that's really a weird chorus. But that chorus comes out of this larger hymn about this song of victory, about this amazing place. And so you can envision them, I especially like on my view, you can envision them trapped. They're trapped and there's nowhere to go, and they need a redeemer. And what a great picture of our life. We are trapped in this world, and if you have found Christ, you found him because you probably came to a place in your life and you said, this sucks. I just don't know where to go with my life. My life is in shambles, and I need a redeemer. And they needed a redeemer, and so God rescued them from that situation. Whichever route they took, he rescued them in this miraculous way, parted the waters, and they went through, and their enemies were destroyed. The thing about this song is you can't sing it unless you've been redeemed. You know, anybody can sing the blues. Anybody can be sad and sorrowful. Anybody can sing country western music and talk about their dog and their pickup truck. But if you want to sing a song of redemption, you have to have been redeemed. And so this is such a wonderful, wonderful thing to realize that we are part of this company. We can sing this song. If you have found Christ in your life, then you can sing this great song of redemption. But simply the fact that you've been redeemed doesn't mean that everything is going to be wonderful from here on in. So they find themselves in this wilderness, either the Sinai Peninsula or in Saudi Arabia. And that area, both those areas are very, very similar. It's very hilly country. There are some low mountains there. It's not desert. You think of desert, I think of Saudi Arabia, you know, sand dunes. It's not that type of desert. It's more like eastern Washington. Lots of shrubs, small trees, bushes, ravines filled with brush and you know, wandering through that. And it's pretty rough, a lot of rocks. So they get across, they've had this great redemption, and they're still running. In my mind, I'm seeing them. They're just still in this sense of terror. It's been maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. And, you know, I can imagine them being caught up in the emotion of their entire lives have shifted from being in slavery to being free. But there's also this terror that they've been running from for weeks. And I imagine them even after the crossing, and there's this huge relief, but there's still this sense of emotion of let's just get as far from this place as we possibly can. And 3 days into the wilderness, they realize we don't have enough water. We don't have enough food. We don't have what we need, the basic necessities to live on. So there are 3 things that they need that it talks about in 15 and 16. And I'm going to talk to you about them in reverse order because one of the things that God says is he provides manna. Now, no one has any idea what manna is. The Hebrew word for manna means, what is it? So you can imagine the wife says, honey, go out there and fill your basket with what's it? That's basically what the word manna means. It means what's it or what is it? So there's this stuff that comes down, and there have been some scholars that have scratched their head and came up with, well, it was the fruit of this kind of a plant or whatever. But it doesn't. I think this is one of those things where we just simply have to say, yeah, this wasn't natural. God might use nature to provide some of our needs. Sometimes he just steps in supernatural ways and does things that we had no idea how that works. And this is one of those occasions. So for the entire 40 years, every morning except for Sunday when they get or Saturday when they get up, there's this stuff laying on the ground that's edible. Some sort of a breadish kind of a thing. The other thing that he provides is quail. Now, I was fascinated about this, so I Googled, what are the small birds and quail of the Sinai Peninsula in Saudi Arabia. And I saw a YouTube video of these young boys, and they had stretched this net. It was about this high for, long ways, out in the middle of the wilderness, in the middle of the sagebrush, really fine mesh net you could hardly see. And there were little birds caught all over in it. So they stretch it out in the evening, and they come back in the morning. During the night, these birds are flying around, and they get caught in these nets. And they're all over out there. They're just thick. And so here are all these quail all around. They're not very big, but there's just millions of them literally out there. You can kill them with a stick. You can hit them with a rock. You can use a sling and catch them. So suddenly, out of the bushes, there's this huge quantity of quail. And God meets their needs sometimes in very specific ways. Sometimes God answers your prayer and, replaces the fluorescent lights. He just does that. Sometimes he provides income in ways that just, you can explain it. Yeah, that's how that's how it happened. But that was an answer to my prayer. And what I have found in my life is that God brings you to the place to trust him in the areas where you really have need. He will bring you to a point where you haven't had to trust him in an area before, and suddenly you have to trust him in that area. These people in Egypt, they didn't have to worry about their food. They were under slavery. It was harsh conditions, but you can grow anything out of that area. The region of Goshen is kind of like the Green River Valley used to be, for those of you that are my age. When I was a kid, the Green River Valley every winter would flood. There was almost the whole area was water. Even the houses down there had high foundations because they expected during the winter there'd be water everywhere. But then when the water receded, man, it was the best growing area in the world. That farmland down there is this really deep, thick, black soil, and you can grow anything down there. That's the way Goshen is. So they could grow anything in Goshen. And so they had the leeks, they had vegetables, they had all kinds of wonderful things to eat. Now they're in the wilderness. They couldn't bring all that stuff with them. Yeah, they brought enough provisions to last for maybe a couple of weeks, but they're running out. And they're thinking about those onions and leeks and squashes and they're in the wilderness. And God often brings us to the place in those wildernesses where we have to trust him in ways we hadn't trusted him before. And when we learn to trust him, when we see how he meets our needs, that's a way that we begin to hear God's voice in a more powerful way. I remember the very first year, I've told this story before, but first year we were married, we were living in Canada, we couldn't work, and we had enough money to live for 8 months. Bare minimum. You wouldn't believe what we lived on, but we got by for 8 months. At the end of 8 months, we had nothing left. And all that we were praying, saying, God, you're going to have to take care of the last month because it's going to be empty. And when we came to the last month, we had way more money than we had any other month. Way more money. And I remember one day we looked at each other and said, man, we should have spent all our money right away. Trusted God for a month. We lived like kings all year. And yet we lived like paupers until the last month. And when we had to trust God, we lived like kings. The other thing they need is water. And they come, it says in verse 22, they traveled for 3 days. They came to Marah, and they could not drink the water. There's water there. It's right in front of them, but the water is bitter. And so, there are those times where you think God's providing something for you, and you think, oh, this is the answer to my prayer, and it just doesn't go the way you think it is. There are times in your life when events just don't go the way you imagined, and it's so easy to find yourself with that bitter water. Isaiah talks about bitter water and how harmful that is and how God wants to restore the bitterness in our hearts. Hebrews talks about bitterness like a root, that it can grow down in you and just affect where you are. And I imagine every one of you have been through times of pretty tremendous bitterness and angst and sorrow, and it's hard to get beyond those. And honestly, it's not just a magic formula that you can say, I'm not going to be bitter anymore. It does take time to get beyond that. But we need to be careful that we allow God to throw the tree into our bitter water and to purge that bitterness from us. There are some people that their bitterness is passed on for generations and generations. And if you harbor that bitterness, if you cling to that bitterness, it can just work its way down into your soul and just destroy your life. But God tells Moses that there's a tree that will cure the bitterness. And do you know what the tree is for us? It's the tree of life. It's the cross. Ultimately, all of the psychology, all the formulas that humans can give for you will not erase the bitterness. But the cross can erase the bitterness. It's so important, I think, as we come to this passage, to remember that God's interest in us isn't just to conform us to a specific way of life. He didn't create us just because he wanted humans to follow one specific way of life. He wants us to enjoy life to the full. In this passage, it says, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. This is the very first time that God said he is the God of healing. And bitterness is is a form of disease. It's a form of infection. It is something we need to be healed from. And God's not saying that he's going to remove every single disease from your life, but he's going to remove the disease of the Egyptians. And how I interpret that is that there are many things that we do that destroy ourselves, that destroy our bodies. We eat things that we shouldn't be eating, or too much of things we shouldn't be eating. We engage in activities which are not healthy for us. We enter into relationships that are not healthy for us. And all of those things which are detrimental to us, God wants to heal us from them. And the Epistle of Peter tells us that healing isn't just about our bodies, it's about our souls. It's really the definition of sanctification, or becoming holy. And so we have a God that doesn't just simply want us to perform or to live up to certain ideals. He wants us to live life to the full. And he says, these are the parameters. If you want to have a full and abundant life, then these are the parameters. I'm giving you these guidelines so that you will live life to the fullest. And if you do that, then these things which have been affecting you, all these things which have been weighing you down, I can heal you of those. And ultimately, that healing, the New Testament tells us, is in the cross. So this morning, communion is a wonderful time to revisit the cross. It's a wonderful time to be refreshed and to be renewed and say, God, Maybe there's a root of bitterness that you've just been pushing over, you've been cloving over and saying, yeah, that's just who I am. It's just part of what I am. I'm just going to have to live with that. And maybe God wants to take that out. He wants to dig that root out. Maybe there's some behavioral things that God has said, you know what, you're doing this, it's not really good. You need to change. There's some words that you're saying, there's some speech that you're doing, there's people you're avoiding, there are encounters that you're not having. Those aren't good for you. I need to heal you of that. And it begins with the cross. As we transition to communion, I want to invite you to take your hymnal. I want you to think about what we've been discovering in this passage. And take your hymnal and turn to 336. And let's just sing the first and the last verses of this hymn. And I want you to not just sing it, but I want the words to mean something to you this morning. I want you to come afresh to the cross. So stand with me, and as the elders come, we'll sing verses 1 and 4. Out of my bondage, sorrow, and night, Jesus, I come, Jesus, I come, into thy freedom, gladness, and light. Jesus, I come to thee. Out of my sickness into thy health, out of my want and into thy wealth, out of my sin and into thyself. Jesus, I come to thee. Out of the fear and dread of the tomb, Jesus, I come, Jesus, I come, unto thy rest and in thy home. Jesus, I come to thee. Out of thy spirit and out of thy flow, unto thy strength and treasures I own. Ever thy glorious face to behold, Jesus, I come to thee. You may be seated.
So I woke up this morning, and I woke up early. Normally on the weekends, I don't wake up before my alarm goes off. My alarm goes off, and then I go back to sleep for a while on the weekend. But I woke up before my alarm went off. Woke up at 6:55, and I was kind of surprised about that. I went to bed kind of early, but it's kind of weird waking up at 6:55. And so I was laying in bed for a while, and Katie was already up, and she had showered. She came to the bed, and she said, "Did you remember that today was daylight savings?" I went, "No, I completely forgot." And I was so glad that it was fall back instead of spring forward, right? Because I had an extra hour in the morning, which was nice. And so I mentioned that story to let you know that one of the ways that God speaks to me is through things that I do in my life that I repeat. And so it helps me remember things. And one of those things is communion. We have communion once a month here at church, and it's open to everybody who's a follower of Jesus. You don't need to be a member of our church to have communion. If you're a follower of Christ, you're welcome to have communion with us. And it just is such a good reminder to me about the length that God went to for us, so that, as Jonathan said, we can have that abundant life.